Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Healthy Soils for Sustainable Cotton webinar series. With us today is Willie Durham. Mr. Durham is a regional soil health specialist with the Natural Resources Conservation Services Soil Health Division. He provides training, guidance, and technical resources to Natural Resources Conservation Services employees, customers, and partners to help improve the health and function of our nation's soils. Mr. Durham has been with the Natural Resources Conservation Service since 2002, having served in the roles of State Conservation Agronomist and Conservation Agronomist prior to assuming his current position as a Soil Health Specialist. Before that, Mr. Durham worked as a regional agronomist for Novartis Seeds, now Syngenta, and as a field sales representative for Helena Chemical Company and Terra International Incorporated. Mr. Durham earned his Bachelor of Science in Etymology and Master of Agriculture in Agricultural Chemistry from Texas A&M University. He became a certified crop advisor in 1992. In this webinar episode, Mr. Durham will discuss soil health planning principles. He will focus on how to optimize the foundational principles of soil health, such as minimizing disturbance, maximizing diversity, maximizing the presence of living roots, and maximizing soil cover. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Durham.
Thank you. Okay, can you see everything, Camille?
I cannot see your screen right now. All right, perfect. You're good to go.
Okay, thank you very much, Camille. I want to speak to you today about soil health planning principles, and part of what we're looking at is that we're going to go through and list and explain the soil health principles, and we're going to identify and explain how conservation practices address those particular principles in the system, and we're going to identify core soil health practices in your region that you can do to enhance soil health in your cropland situations. So NRCS defines soil health as the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. There's some key words here that we need to pay attention to. One in particular that I like to pay attention to, of course, is soil function. And soil function is related to the 4 ecosystem processes that are in every agroecosystem that we work with. And the 4 ecosystem processes are, of course, there are the carbon cycle, in which we're turning solar energy into chemical energy. And then we're, of course, feeding the biocommunity cycle, which is the soil food web, the microorganisms, the bacteria, the fungi, the protozoa, nematodes, on up to microarthropods, and then all the plants, diverse amounts of plants and animals that are also integrated into those systems. When we build the soil system up, we tend to see that we have a functioning water cycle, and we get more infiltration, and we get more water holding capacity and availability. Along with that, and all the biology and the amount of carbon going in the system, we get a properly functioning nutrient cycle. So the whole purpose of all this is to point out that 90% of soil function is mediated by soil microbes. And this is where we get our physical stability and support and habitat for the biology that's in the soil. The problem is that in conventional agriculture, at least a lot of the areas that I work, particularly where we grow cotton, grain, sorghum, corn, these different acre types of crops, there's a lot of characteristics of soil function loss. And they suggest some various pictures that we have that we show many of our students and farmers to illustrate some of that function loss that has occurred. But what has happened within our soil systems is we've had a downward spiral of soil degradation. We've increased the tillage. We've reduced the amount of residues on the ground. We've actually incorporated those into the soil. We've reduced the amount of diversity of plants and things that we have in that system. And these things lead to soil organic matter loss. Erosion is increased. We get a lot of compaction in these systems. We break up the aggregates that are in the soil. The soil is not able to take in water. You get a lot of crusting, surface compaction. So there's just been a lot of degradation that is caused by simple farming practices. The use of tillage, the use of fertilizers, and chemicals and pesticides all affect the different ecosystem processes. So we just have to understand that we're getting a lot of these degradations in the soil system that we really don't want to have. And so we have to work on that. And we have to do things that typically take us from a general characteristics of these cultivated types of soils in which we're not getting the water infiltration. We don't get the biological activity. We simply want to change that whole particular system, okay? And the productivity of conventional agriculture systems are really, they're maintained by increased technology, labor, fuel, nutrients, pesticides, and water. You know, we're simply solving symptoms of our management. And so our challenge is that we want to regain soil function. Resource concerns are addressed. We want to make sure that inputs can be reduced. We want agricultural productivity is sustainably maintained. And you know, the question is it possible to achieve all of this? So after years and years of the historic loss of soil carbon? Well, the answer is yes, and it's simply a soil aggregation climb that we have to go through. We have to gain and enhance all of those ecosystem processes, such as biological activity, to increase the organic matter turnover and the amount of organic matter that is being sustainably maintained in the soil system, but yet turned over to provide the improved nutrient cycling that we need to have. Also provide the improved soil structure. At that point, we see noticeable change usually, and then we improve the water availability, which is very important in a lot of areas that I work in Texas and Oklahoma. But simply just to show you a picture, very simply right here, this is courtesy of Jim Johnson and Noble Research Station. On the left, you see where no-till and cover crops have been implemented on the land. You don't see any water ponding or anything like that. The farmer that's on the right has been tilling the soil excessively using inorganic fertilizers and chemicals and things like this. So you see all the water ponding. There's not a proper water cycle occurring. So we're getting all this particular degradation. The way that we fix all of that is that we follow the 4 principles that conserve and regenerate the soil ecosystem. We manage disturbance, or minimize disturbance, excuse me. We maximize the living cover, and we maximize biodiversity, and we maximize continuous living roots. If we follow that, one of the key things that we do is that we end up with the understanding that the soil organisms are driving the benefits obtained through achieving and improving the condition of these particular principles. Therefore, what we want to do is, from a soil health perspective, we want to feed the diverseness of the biology that's in the soil. We want to fuel that soil biology. We want to improve resilience by building up forms of organic material and stuff in the soil. We want to improve the soil organic matter, actually build soil organic matter. And then the other thing we want to do is we want to protect. We want to protect those soil aggregates. We want to protect the organism habitat, okay, and also the soil organic matter through the production of those aggregates. Now, when we protect the soil, we're doing this simply because we want to maintain stable aggregates in the soil. That helps protect soil organic matter, and we want to manage the erosion. Anytime we are able to create aggregates, we don't get the amount of erosion, you know, when we have a rainfall event or when we have wind erosion. It also reduces that occurs when we have this aggregation to the soil. And we also buffer the temperature that is out there in that soil system by leaving and maximizing different things like cover. And we also reduce the amount of evaporation that comes off because we don't have a bare soil. And we also course, as I mentioned earlier, maintain soil organic matter. So there's many ways we can use things like no-till planters to minimize the disturbance. You see a no-till planter here planting directly into a green cover. So there's no bare soil exposed in that particular system. That's a very good way to do things. We also use no-till drills. We want to minimize the disturbance because we want to reduce the habitat for the, we don't want to reduce the habitat for the soil organisms that are there. And we also want to, don't want to destroy the soil structure. And there's many types of disturbance. We typically look at physical disturbance, which of course is excess tillage. And of course we have chemical, which is the overuse of fertilizer and pesticides. Biological is things like overgrazing or possibly fallowing systems for long 6 to 8 months during the year. The photograph that you see there shows the different types of tillage and planting implements and the amount of disturbance that they create. Thankfully, we're going more and more people and farmers, ranchers are going to low disturbance types of drills, and they're getting away from moldboard plows and things like this. So the conservation practices that minimize disturbance include residue and tillage management, conservation cover and nutrient management, IPM, prescribed grazing. I won't go into much detail about that, but one of the things we want to do, we want to minimize disturbance because whenever we till the soil, we stimulate copiotrophic bacteria in the soil, okay, which tend to eat and consume all the carbon that was put into that soil system. And they grow in population. They're respiring at that same time. And so we get this continuous, this big flux of soil respiration or carbon dioxide, and at a period of time when we do not have any plants there to pick that particular carbon dioxide up. So what we want to do is we want to implement things like minimizing the disturbance or doing no-till so that we don't get that soil respiration to occur early in the season. We want to spread that out, and we want to have live living plants there that are able to pick up the carbon dioxide that's coming from the biology in the soil, and essentially we get a better working carbon cycle in that system. The other thing that we want to look at is we want to maximize soil cover. Crop residue and other organic materials such as mulch and compost, when left on the soil surface, provide a protective barrier between the soil and the destructive force of raindrops and wind. So in addition, it moderates the extremes in soil temperature, and it reduces the evaporative losses from the soil. We're going to go into some more detail here later, but what we're trying to do is by having those surface covers out there, particularly in the arid Southwest, we're reducing the amount of reflective index or the amount of infrared radiation or whatever is being reflected back up to the atmosphere. So in other words, we kind of lessen the temperatures, and also the temperature of the soil is much less so that biological activity will be able to work. So why do we maximize cover? Well, we want to reduce erosion. We want to increase the infiltration rate, which is very critical. We want to reduce evaporation, which you will get from bare soils. We want to buffer that soil temperature. We want to insulate the soil. We want to create the habitat for soil organisms and food for that biology. And then, of course, we want to address things like compaction from machines and livestock. I've seen where we started increasing the amount of organic matter and the amount of residues on top of the soil surface. The soil itself becomes a sponge, and that's what we like to see. This is a slide from Nathan Louder, and he's talking about the fact that when we do things like that and we leave those residues on top of the soil surface, it helps us to endure heat stress. Because a lot of times, and these are just photographs here, we're trying to utilize live plants and surface cover to conserve moisture and reduce temperature. We're trying to, we're looking at crop yields, many times are limited more often by hot and dry, not cool and wet conditions. Okay, so it's critical to get this type of material on the ground and regulate those soil temperatures. This is a slide from J.J. McIntyre. This is all the way back to 1956. I had the opportunity to speak with Mr. McIntyre. At that time, it was the Soil Conservation Service, and they would always carry thermometers and infiltration rings with them all the time to explain the relationship between temperature and moisture. And so one of the key things is that whenever you have high amounts of soil temperature, and you just have to understand that bare soil temperatures can exceed ambient air temperatures by 10 to 20 degrees. And plants' use of moisture is directly linked to soil temperature. At 70 degrees, you see here 100% of the moisture is used for growth. None is lost. At 70 degrees, at 100 degrees, you lose 85% of your moisture through evapotranspiration. At 113, 100% of the soil moisture is lost through evapotranspiration, and no plant growth is occurring. That hot temperature, usually when you get up to about 113, up to 120, you actually start to cook protein in the soil. So literally, the plants avoid being cooked by using the moisture that they have caught in the soil for air conditioning, more or less. But the problem is that when you reach temperatures of, say, over 120, 130 degrees, soil organisms also start to die. So it's important to manage that full soil condition. And that's one of the things that we do, and that's why it's important to have the surface covers and live living plants on the ground at all times. In Southwest, one of the things that we're creating because of the tillage and the bare soil conditions is that we're creating something that I learned about from Dr. Christine Jones out of Australia, is that we have created a heat dome effect. Many of our areas that I work with that have tilled soil surfaces, particularly in central Texas, the ambient temperature, when we get 100-degree days or better, the soil surface on bare fields can reach up to 155 degrees in the top 1 to 2 inches of the soil. So this extreme heat sterilizes the soil along with the use of chemicals and fertilizers and all these things that we're doing. Key thing to pay attention to here is that creates a heat dome effect. So in other words, it creates a high pressure system so that because of all the infrared radiation that's being reflected back up into the air. So this high pressure heat dome or whatever actually pushes moisture, cool, moist, low pressure systems and air cannot push away that particular high pressure heat dome. And this is one of the positive reinforcement feedbacks whereby, degrading these landscapes, we're actually creating a desert condition. And that's what happens in a lot of the soil systems that I deal with in Texas, Oklahoma, and also over in New Mexico, partly. So we just need to pay attention to that. Practices that maximize that soil cover are listed here. Won't really go into much detail on them for time purposes, but we're essentially, that's what we're using. We're using them in a way to enhance that ecosystem process. Now, how soil health principles support soil function. When we talk about feeding the soil system, we want to stimulate ground diversity. We want to increase soil organic matter. We want to improve the nutrient cycling capacity of the soil, enhance plant growth, break the pest cycles, increase predator and pollinator populations by having pollinator plants and different things that support those beneficial types of insects. We want to maximize the amount of living roots. The area that you have immediately around the plant root, which is the rhizosphere, is typically where the highest number of greatest diversity of soil microorganisms are found. And so we want to enhance that. We want to understand that living plant roots exude numerous carbon compounds, and they slough cells off from root surfaces. And the organic carbon additions to the ecosystem feed soil organisms, and they contribute to the habitat development within that system. Plant roots are also involved in complex biogeochemical communication now with soil microbes, whereby beneficial microorganisms are recruited. We get a lot of plant growth promoting bacteria that I'm learning about right now. And we also get added biology such as mycorrhizal types of fungi and stuff that associate with close to 90% of all the plants that we grow. So it's important to understand that we have to have these living roots to support that particular type of biology. So how do we maximize that? We grow crops in the off season. We don't let the ground go fallow. We avoid that. We increase the time possibly that maybe we have crop rotations that include perennial crops. And we mainly, what we're doing is we're managing rotations, and we're making sure that we leave stubble, and we're following these soil health principles and things that are needed. And these are, of course, some of the practices that follow up. A lot of these practices are redundant, and they have several and provide several points of function that they can help us to enhance the ecosystem processes that are in the soil. But now I'm talking about maximizing biodiversity. A lot of people, we maximize biodiversity with cover crop mixtures, having different types of plants, different types of flowering plants, grasses, legumes, primarily just diverse crop rotations, as well as integrated crop livestock systems. A lot of people consider crop or livestock integration to be a fifth principle, but it's actually part of biodiversity within that soil system. And it can be an important component of integrated pest management plan, and it can contribute to overall system resilience in that particular system. So essentially, everything is working as a holistic system, and we're trying to get the different plant species and even cultivars, all these different things that support the different soil microbial communities within that particular soil system. Okay, so we maximize the biodiversity by growing diverse cover crops, legumes, diversity of crop rotation, integrating livestock, possibly including perennial crops, and of course here are the processes that do that. Now, what I'm going to go into is that in order to enhance all these ecosystem processes, I'm going to go into more detail. I'm going to talk about soil health management systems. This is how we enhance. We have to understand that the soil is a living factory. Nature functions in wholes and patterns in these systems, and there's a lot of compounding and cascading effects. We have to understand that we have to use management activities to improve the soil, not degrade it. Okay, so what you see over here on the left is that we're having to build this microscopic organism habitat, okay, that is actually fueling this whole process, and then we're watching our management activities such as tillage and fertilizer, pesticides, all these things, and trying to use them in a way that supports the biological aspect of that particular soil. Many times when I work out in areas of Texas and Oklahoma, I run into this typical situation. We're doing conventional agriculture. We are following a chemical paradigm which focuses on the physical properties. That's all that's left in that particular soil that you see there on the left. However, we're transitioning to an ecological paradigm in which that depends on the management-dependent properties. Those are the things that we can change in the soil system, and we have control over. We can change the organic matter content. We can change the biological activity. We can change the aggregate stability in the soil. We can change the infiltration, the soil fertility, and we can also buffer the soil reaction, the pH. So there's a lot of things that are occurring here, and we have to understand that we can enhance those ecosystem processes. And it doesn't really matter what areas that you're in. This is a typical soil from Stanton, Texas, out in West Texas. You see the soil on the left that's been extensively tilled, used inorganic fertilizers. You can see how it has a lot of iron in it that's been oxidized. You get that orangey looking color of soil. However, the soil that was right across the county road that was doing no-till and initiating the process of planting covers, you can see the difference in the color of the soil. It's retaining more organic matter. It has a little bit more aggregation. This also happens in other areas of Texas. Just showing you here, this is Jonathan Cobb from Rogers, Texas. Soil on the left is a farmer that does extensive tillage, uses fertilizers. You see that the soil has lost structure. You see a lot of crusting in the particular soil. And then Jonathan's soil, which is on the right, that has cover crops and annual cover and commodity crop and does grazing. you can see how the soil is actually aggregated. Actually, in the soil on the right, you can actually see here's a haystack from earthworms. Earthworm activity is out the roof in this particular soil, which helps us tremendously. Here's another picture of those particular soils. You see the difference. You can actually see a difference in color. You see the soils on the left that are dysfunctional or grayish looking color. The soils on the right have more function, and they're also a darker color indicating more organic matter and activity. Actually, a difference in soil organism habitat. There we have mycorrhizal fungi association over here on the right. There's two new resource concerns that we are now implementing at NRCS, and one is that we want to pay attention to aggregate instability. We want to manage induced degradation of water-stable soil aggregates in the soil, excuse me. And we also want to enhance soil organism habitat loss. We want to soil organism habitat, excuse me. So one of the resource concerns is soil organism habitat loss or degradation. What we're finding is in a lot of these soil systems, we're needing to get more fungal activity. I'm going to go into more detail on that in succeeding slides. We use a lot of demonstrations to illustrate these points between function and non-functioning soils. We do several slake and aggregation demonstrations showing the contrast. We also use things in the field. I've used this a lot. It's called a slump test. You see the soil over here on the right has maintained its structure. It's a darker color. The soil that's over here in the left and in the middle are soils that are somewhat more degraded. You see the change in color. You see the actual soil that we're on the left that's more extremely degraded. You can see how it's turning into a pancake on that clipboard. So it's not able to maintain its structure, not able to hold water. There's a lot of things that are literally going wrong in that system. So what we want to understand is we farm sunlight. We turn sunlight into photosynthate. That photosynthate is fed is used to produce growth in plants. Those plants also exude some of those root exudates to feed the microbes in the soil. And one of the things that is happening is we're building these biological hotspots or these spheres of influence. And this is where the soil organisms live in that particular soil. And you can actually see this when you start understanding that you're following ecological paradigm. You can start to see these things start to enhance themselves in that soil system. And we eventually go from a chemical paradigm of which we're putting inputs, and it's an input-driven system, and that we're feeding the soil directly. And we're getting all these environmental issues, and we get into the degradation of all these ecosystem processes. And then we see as we transition and we start paying attention to the biological, ecological paradigm, that it focuses on photosynthesis, and it's the rate and capacity. And we're feeding the microbes through the root system, and that's feeding the soil, and that's giving us all the structure and stability and things that we need to have. Nature's chemistry is root exudates. Became very familiar with this. We're in areas that are very arid. We have areas that have extensive amounts of clay. We get a lot of compaction. One of the ways to correct that is that soil aggregation actually in the soil begins by getting those root exudates and those polysaccharides into that soil, so that clay particles start to flocculate, or they start to clump together within the soil system. So that's where the aggregation process begins. It begins with these polysaccharides creating that particular space. What's interesting is you see all these areas of white that are in this photograph. This is from the nature and properties of soils. But these areas of space that have been created allow access by mycorrhizal fungi. And those are the thin mycorrhizal filaments or whatever they're able to access those particular areas that are created whenever you get flocculation and things to the soil. So once you get the mycorrhizal fungi into that picture, what they are is that they're the actual major holders of calcium. They can actually extract or pull calcium off the cation exchange sites, and they hold them on their fungal hyphae. And here's just a picture of the calcium crystals retained on the fungal hyphae. Okay. Now, what's important about this is that since they're the major holders of calcium, we get the proper ratio of calcium to magnesium in the soil, and that's actually an indicator of how aerobic and porous your soil system can be, particularly in calcium soils that are calcareous and soils that have a lot of clay content. Okay, as we build that particular system, then we also build the populations of bacteria. Protozoa come in, they start creating more and more space within that particular system. Then we also have nematodes that come in, and we're creating the habitat for them to be there. They create even more space within the system to where we're getting this real good aggregated and porous soil that allows the roots to glide effortlessly through the soil. Just notice the increased pore space and the aggregated structure. That makes it much easier for roots to penetrate and get down into the soil system. The more aggregation we get deeper in the soil process, the better root systems we will have and deeper structure of roots we'll have at depth. One of the key things about that is, and you probably may have already seen this is from Nathan Lauder. We use this in presentation and teaching. This is the infiltration test, 6-inch infiltration rings. And it's important to understand about infiltration rate, enhancing that soil structure so that we get more and more water into the soil system. Okay, this is just an illustration of that, how to do that particular test. We measure the amount of infiltration in time, and then you take that amount of time in minutes, 1 over the amount of time in minutes times 60 gives you the inches per hour, and that's your infiltration rate. This is very important, particularly in the Southwest, because water is very, very important. And so we have to infiltrate water. We get heavy rainfall events many times, so our soil's capacity to infiltrate water is very, very important, because if it can't go in the ground, it's going to run off. And so we have to understand how to illustrate and how to show farmers to enhance their infiltration rate. Because many farms that I work with have, that are especially those that are tilled extensively, have less than a ½ inch per hour infiltration rate. So when we get 2-3 inches of rain, the water literally does not penetrate and does not go into the soil. Thus, we don't have it for plant production. Okay. One of the other things that we need to pay attention to is that we need to focus on the bacteria and fungi that are within the system, actually get more balance of those things. Many of the systems that I run into are disrupted soil ecosystems because when you get all this bare soil and you've done all this particular tillage, you've turned that system into a bacterially dominated system. Okay, and that's not a good thing because you also turn the nitrogen form that is out there, you change it into a nitrate nitrogen form. And I'm going to explain how that's not beneficial to your system. We have to understand that there's always ecological succession occurring in these soil systems, and ecological succession is just the growth of pioneer species in areas that have been disturbed, okay, but you haven't lost a particular soil. An example is if we remove all the vegetation above ground, you would see a natural succession of plants come back onto that soil, and there would be a natural succession of biology which follows the succession of those particular plants. When you get that to happen, you have to understand that soil biological succession causes plant succession that you see above ground. So one of the key things that we're doing is, and by doing no-till and adding cover crops to this particular system, cropping system, is we're trying to get more fungal complexity to where it balances the bacteria and fungi within that system. When those things happen, you also get a balance of, or you get more nitrogen that is not converted into nitrate, but it stays as the ammonium form. Whenever bacteria are eaten by protozoa, protozoa excrete ammonium. That ammonium in a bacterially dominated system is immediately converted into nitrate. In a system that has more balance and more fungi, and of course the pH starts to become more neutral, you don't get that transition of that ammonium being transformed into nitrate. Okay, and you also get, because of all the biological activity, you also get about half of what's being excreted by protozoa, and particularly nematodes. You get more of what are considered to be microbial metabolites. These are just simple forms of organic nutrients, and those things can be picked up by the plant, and they're way more energy efficient. So in our agricultural systems, we would like to have a system, because right now we're in a system where we're bacterially dominated. We have high nitrate, we lack oxygen. We want to take those agroecosystems to a system where they have more balance, and that supports the later successional grasses and the row crops that we're growing, particularly cotton. Cotton actually needs to have more fungi in comparison to bacteria. They will benefit from that tremendously. So one of the other things that we need to pay attention to is that as we're regenerating the soil, we need to understand what's happening in the soil system. And one of the things that we have learned here just recently, or I have picked up on, is that we can actually build soil organic matter. Microbial metabolic processes involved in carbon cycling. There's two more or less pathways that occur here. One's a decomposition pathway, in which we decompose the organic materials and stuff very quickly in the top part of the soil system, like you see here. And then the other system or pathway that we need to pay attention to is the microbial carbon pump. We now know that photosynthesis and plant root exudates are now recognized as constituting the primary pathway for soil building. So photosynthesis and plant root exudates are now recognized as building soil organic matter within the soil system. The plant root inputs build soil carbon 5 times faster than carbon derived from the above ground biomass. Okay, and that's primarily because, and I'm going to show you, is that we're getting a mycorrhizal fungi association with many of these plants, and we also have associated bacteria that work with the mycorrhizal fungi. And so these are just pictures. Again, this is from Dr. Christine Jones. You're seeing this, the soil on the right is using extensive amounts of fertilizer, okay, and fertilizer application of phosphate. You also see that it doesn't have the depth of the A horizon anymore. Everything has been reduced. You see the soil that's on the left is a profile from a paddock in which ground cover has been actively managed to enhance photosynthetic capacity. They haven't been using any inorganic phosphate fertilizer application whatsoever there. And so you see the differences in how the carbon is retained within the system. The soil has sequestered something like 213 tons per hectare of carbon dioxide, or 53 tons per hectare of carbon. It holds over 200% more water. All the soil nutrients, including trace elements, have increased by an average of 162%. The soils are holding way more calcium in that system more, which means that they're becoming more neutral, and the biology can work to do what it needs to do. It's in actually control of the pH. So you're starting to see the pH start to change between the two systems. You also see nutrient availability. One of the reasons to focus on nutrient availability is that many times we have nutrients in the soil that are not in the correct form for the plant to actually use them. Okay, so this is just showing you the amount of, say, calcium, magnesium, zinc, copper, but the amount of those particular nutrients that are in a plant available form to be picked up. Many times in soils, we have to have both nutrients that are in the oxidized form to be used by the plant, and some nutrients that need to be in a reduced form. Oxidized form, these are things like nitrate, phosphate, sulfate. In reduced forms are things like manganese, calcium, magnesium. These types of things need to be in a reduced form. Okay, so that's one of the things to pay attention to. When we build organic matter in the soil, we have to understand the importance of humic substances. One of the key things that we look at is we look at the amount of humates that are being built in the soil. This is a typical humic molecule. And on these humic molecules, you have what are called hydroxyl and carboxyl groups. That's what you see there in the circle. Okay. In the soil solution, the hydrogen ions slough off of those particular hydroxyl and carboxyl groups and create a negative charge. They occur in pairs, so you get a -2 charge. And what that does is that allows the soil to actually grab onto the positively charged cations manganese, copper, iron, zinc, calcium, and magnesium. So what you're doing there is you're building biofertility by building soil organic matter, and you have to understand that you're building the cation exchange capacity, increasing that in the soil's ability to hold on to those particular cations. Now, the other curious thing is that when we build organic matter in the cation exchange capacity of the soil, the anion exchange capacity, which we also need ions or whatever in the anionic form, is also maintained. And the anion exchange capacity is usually, from what I'm told, is 25% of the cation exchange capacity in the soil. Here's another interesting picture that I found interesting. This is from Dr. David Johnson. He was at New Mexico State at the time, but this is a picture of the control. He's starting with desert soil that has no horizon. And then the results after 3.5 years of enhancing soil microbiology, 7 successive crops, of which one of those was cotton. But you can see how he's increased the amount of the horizon within that system. And he's done this simply through the use of soil biology. They're using a biostatic compost that has extensive amounts of bacteria and fungi in it. They're inoculating these particular soils, and then they're using cover crops and then doing minimal tillage and stuff like this. And they're creating this condition where they're enhancing these ecosystem processes. Whenever we start doing no-till, we start leaving residues on top of the soil surface. I have this particular situation come up. A lot of people talk about harboring disease and stuff in the residues. Well, once you start getting your stubble digesting fungi, which are things like trichoderma, they come in and they digest all of those particular stubbles and those residues that are there. The trichoderma fungi also produce both cellulase and chitinase, and that's important in these soil systems because they feed on organic materials, but yet have the ability to feed on nematodes and pathogenic fungi because they produce chitinase. So that's very important to understand. Now, the decomposition process that I told you about is that bacteria, many times the bacterial digestion is mineralization in the soil, and that's where we get all of our nutrients and things like this, which is a good thing, okay? But we also have to understand, what's occurring with the other types of biology that we have in the soil system, and that is with the fungi. Fungi digestion is actually humification. They break things down to the hard to decompose materials, and they break it down over and over and over until it can't be broken down anymore. And what determines that is the amount of lipid content that is in that organic material. If we look at the material that's above ground, it's the amount of phospholipids in the cell membrane that determine what that is. The reason this is important is because bacteria cannot digest fat. Okay, fungi digest complex compounds like cellulose, hemicellulose, and lipids, which are fats, and bacteria cannot do that. Okay, so we have to have these fungi, and it's the fungi that are helping us to build the stable carbon within the system, both in the decomposition area with the biomass above ground as we enhance plant health, and then in the soil with mycorrhizal fungi, we start to build more organic matter or humic substances because they're humifying and they're associating with different forms of other free-fixing nitrogen bacteria and other things that are within that particular soil system. And that's what I wanted to mention. I'll go back here on this last slide, is that when we have the fungi in that soil system, we're also getting more aggregation. We're supporting the free-fixing nitrogen bacteria, and we're supporting the phosphorus solubilizing bacteria. Actually, the mycorrhizal fungi feed those two forms of bacteria in that soil system. That helps us obtain phosphorus and helps us obtain nitrogen. The mycorrhizal fungi are important because they're an extension of the root system. They can get into depleted zones. They help us to close the nitrogen loop. Mycorrhizae assist with organic forms of nitrogen uptake. Here, this is just a photograph. This is from University of California, Irvine, that I picked up years ago. But it was a source that nitrogen uptake is unique, okay, because these particular types of fungi can pick up organic or amino acids and actually carry them and go through the photosynthesis process. So it's very important to understand that this is what you're getting. You get free-fixing nitrogen bacteria in that particular system. That particular nitrogen, especially in an amino acid form, can be picked up and carried back to the plant. It's very beneficial. Other things that I've learned about mycorrhizal fungi is that we also get a bacterial fungal type of highway that's produced. I didn't really know this, but the hyphae or whatever are hydrophobic, so water accumulates around the hyphae, and it actually creates a condition where things like Pseudomonas petita, which are plant growth promoting bacteria, can move along that fungal hyphae. And so it's a way to transport it. Before, I thought that bacteria really couldn't move very much in the soil other than that they grow in colonies. But now that's not true. Now we're finding out there's a lot of associations. Also, Mycorrhizae assist with the water management in these particular systems. They build what are considered to be vesicles, and it becomes limiting. When moisture becomes limiting during dry periods, the mycorrhizal plant utilizes water stored in root vesicles. They also store nutrients. I understand now, after reading some other research, that many times vesicles are formed and they store lipids or fats within that vesicle. And that's actually an energy source for that plant that will be utilized later. Okay, here are just pictures of where you have mycorrhizal association versus where you don't when you plant succeeding crops in the spring. On the left, you see soybeans that have had mycorrhizal association. On the right, you see canola, where you haven't had that association. Also over here on the right, in the right photograph, after fallow period in this demonstration plot, you see the corn is not tasseled out. However, where we had mycorrhizal association with the wheat cover previously, you see that the corn actually has more nutrients, more micronutrients and things, and you see that it's more mature. So these are things that we need to look at and consider to build soil health. I'll mention dirt to soil, one family's journey. Gabe Brown, that's where I learned about soil health when I first came on with NRCS up in Bismarck, North Dakota. And he's showing you here, I show this because I want to illustrate the importance of producing those root exudates and that water, what I consider to be the water extract organic carbon. Okay, this is a particular Haney test. It's one of the reasons to use this, but this shows the differences in farm management. Farm number one is diverse cash grain, tillage, cover crops, no synthetics, no livestock. It's actually an organic farm. Farm 2 is a minimum tillage, 2 crops, moderate synthetics, no livestock. Farm 3 is medium diversity, no till, high synthetic fertilizer and synthetic chemicals, no livestock. And farm number 4 is Gabe's, high diversity, no till, cover crops. He used one herbicide at this particular time. Of course, this was years ago, and he has livestock on there. But I want you to show you this because look at the differences in N, P, and K. Nitrogen, he has over 281 pounds that's available to him. Phosphorus, over 1,000 pounds per acre that are available. And look at the amount of water extract organic carbon. It's just tremendous what that is. And so you're getting these particular systems to work. It's all about photosynthesis, increasing photosynthetic rate and capacity. You can see how he's built his soil organic matter content up. And you can see how he's built his infiltration rate per hour tremendously. So those systems are functioning on their own. And literally what's happened is we've actually increased the dynamic equilibrium state. Those properties that I told you about earlier that we have control of. We've enhanced the water-soluble organic carbon. We've enhanced the aggregation, the infiltration. We've enhanced the water and nutrient holding capacity of that soil. We've enhanced the air and water quality because of the buffering effects that the organic materials have. Okay, we've increased the soil biology habitat, and all with that, you're going to see an increase in productivity. So people like Gabe Brown, we have several people here in Texas that we're now doing these particular things on, and we're increasing productivity along with increasing the ecosystem processes. Okay. I'm going to wrap up here with making fertilizers more biologically and ecologically friendly, because I work with a lot of farmers that are depending on inorganic fertilizer input, particularly in cotton. And one of the things I want you to understand is that there's a common myth about inorganic fertilizers, is that they feed the plant directly. Well, actually, that's not really true. The fertilizer-derived nitrogen only represents about 33 to 55% of the nitrogen in the corn plant. So where does the rest of the nitrogen come from? Well, it comes from the soil organic matter and the soil microbes. So most of the organic nitrogen becomes available later in the growing season as soil temperatures increase and rainfall occurs. So if we can increase our soil organic matter and our microbial life, we can increase the amount, increase our soil nutrient efficiency. So these are some of the things that we need to focus on and pay attention to. Unfortunately, we're using inorganic nitrogen, and so one of the biggest questions that I get is how do we stabilize the nitrogen so that it becomes more biologically friendly and we start getting these ecosystem processes to change? Well, some of the things that we need to do is we need to stabilize the nitrogen, complex it and chelate it, quickly convert it into an amino acid, and that happens through that bacterial mineralization that I mentioned. And then the bacteria also need to have certain biostimulants and things. They need to have soluble carbon, that's a food source. They also need to have sulfur and molybdenum in order to convert the particular nitrogen into an amino acid. And they also need molybdenum. The plants need molybdenum in the soil to convert nitrate into a amino acid, okay? Because they need that for the what's considered to be the nitrate reductase enzyme. So some of the things that we can do is that we can pay attention to things like nitrogen and sulfur ratios in the soil, make sure we have a 10 to 1 ratio of that. And we can also start to use what I've learned about as far as micronized Lenardite, which is actually a humic material that retains all the qualities of humans, humic acids, and fulvic acids. Okay. Of course, if you can't use that, you can still use humic acid that's chemically extracted with potassium hydroxide, and use that. Excuse me. In this situation, we want to use that about 3% of the nitrogen solution. That should be very effective at holding all the nitrogen in place. We also add molybdenum, as I mentioned to you earlier, that's necessary for a micronutrient that's needed for the nitrate reductase enzyme and also the nitrogenase enzyme. And then we also, one of the things that we want to do, and I've had a ridicule about this, and that is adding molasses back at 5% of the nitrogen solution volume. You want to do that because that's what supports the biology that actually feeds the biology that are in the soil. It's not the actual humus material. The humus materials is chelating or complexing with the fertilizer. The molasses is actually stimulating the biology to grow, consume, and hold more of that particular nitrogen in that system. So these are some of the things that we can do in that situation as far as nitrogen is concerned. When it comes to phosphorus and mycorrhizal fungi, the key is inorganic phosphorus and phosphate inhibits mycorrhizal fungi and phosphorus solubilizing bacteria. Okay, actually the plants do not produce what's called a strigolactone when they have amounts of phosphate available. When they sense phosphate, they stop sending those sugars and exudates, and so there's no strigolactone, which is a root growth hormone, being put into that soil system, forming associations with the mycorrhizal fungi and these other types of bacteria. So what we want to do there is we want to understand that we can use micronized humate. This particular, since it's micronized, it complexes and not only chelates with cations, but it complexes with anions. So we want to understand that. We want to use it in order to complex with that particular phosphorus so that it's not recognized as being organic. Okay. So anytime we use inorganic fertilizer, this is wheat. You can see how it's associated here at the top. The roots have associated with biology. The soil is actually sticking to the roots. Okay. When it hit the fertilizer band, you see how the roots become white and clean. Okay. And they're not putting out any root exodus, and they're not associating with biology. Okay. Here's another picture. Corn You see here over here on the right, they have used extensive amounts of, I think it was diammonium phosphate or MAP, monoammonium phosphate. But you see how the roots are clean. Okay, you see some other interesting things. You see reddish color and things like that. But then the plants that are over here on the left, they manage to have that biological association, no fertilizers or inorganic fertilizers, and you can see how their root systems are sticking soil to themselves, which means that the root exodus is flowing out into the soil. Very important to understand that actually in areas where we're growing commodity crop of corn, we can actually build soil organic matter. Corn is a very good variety or whatever or crop that puts lots of carbon into the soil system. I just listened to a webinar and they were mentioning that during the year, Midwest corn crop during the growing season has the capability of putting upwards of something like 15,000 pounds of actual carbon into that soil system. And so the effects of this are tremendous. We just need to understand how that works. Rhizal sheaths, this is what we want to focus on. We want to build that particular thing up. And, you know, when it comes to phosphorus and mycorrhizal fungi, we just need to regenerate that optimal system. We want to reduce the quantity of fertilizer per application. We want to buffer and stabilize fertilizer with micronizal and ardite if possible. If not, use humic acids that also have fulvic acid in them to accomplish the same issue. But it depends. It increases crop utilization from 15 up to 60%. And then we also want to add phosphorus solubilizing microbes and biostimulants to get these particular things back into that soil system. If we do that, these agronomic efficiencies will be optimized. When soil health is maximized, we'll see that managing for a living ecosystem is key to optimum production, and we can take production and conservation further with management systems, soil health management systems that continually build soil health. So we want to capture that particular potential. We want to build this management system to support the enhancement of the ecosystem processes that are there. So we need to use a little bit of ingenuity. We need to change or tweak how we use things like fertilizers, even things like herbicides, which I didn't mention, can also benefit from the use of things like humic acids and things like that. So with that, I'll wrap up my discussion and talk, and enjoyed being invited to speak about soil health principles.
Thank you, Mr. Durham, for sharing these soil health planning principles with the Healthy Soils for Sustainable Cotton webinar series. If anybody in the audience has questions for Mr. Durham regarding his presentation, you can contact us at info@soilhealthinstitute.org. And in the next episode, Dr. Buzz Clute will talk about the ecological nutrient management systems. So subscribe to our channel to access new episodes of Healthy Soils for Sustainable Cotton as they are released. Thank you, everybody.